Hello and welcome to When Football Began Again, the podcast that takes a nostalgic look at the Premier League era. Today's show is a best bits compilation episode, some of my favourite moments from season one. I'm going to release a few of these in these pre-season months before the season comes back and I launch series 2 in September. I've got some fantastic guests who've been on season one. There is Marv Dickinson and James Cook discussing Sky Sports' A Whole New Ball Game ad campaign that launched the Premier League. I've got Brian Deane talking about his first Premier League goal and Simon Emanuel talking about a Swansea, Jamaica legend. Rob Fletcher talks about how the idea for the Premier League came to be. And Joe Rawson and Danny Wilson give differing perspectives on Paulo Di Canio's infamous push from the perspective of the dugout and the stands. And we end with that first ever round of Play Your Apps Right, a chaotic game born in our pilot episode. I really hope you enjoy this. Sit back, relax, enjoy some of those best bits. And as ever, please, if you enjoy the show, do leave me a review and share it with friends and subscribe. Enjoy Best Bits, Part 1. What were the memories for you guys of that transition from the First Division?
Well, listen, the first thing to talk, I'm sure James will agree, is the whole new ball game slogan that they had. You think Boris Johnson has given "We Got Brexit Done" a lot of... You've no idea how much a slogan has been hammered unless you're around in the summer of '92. Whole new ball game. There was the advert to Simple Minds, which is just incredible.
Yeah, and it's even as a 15-year-old, I thought, well, this is unintentionally homoerotic.
It still triggers me now when I watch it.
The Premier League then, it didn't have foreign stars. We were the poor man of Europe. They were all in Italy or Spain. They were not in the Premier League. So all the players that they're promoting to promote their new Premier League are sort of very... and I don't mean any offence by this because a lot of them were sort of internationals at the top of their game, but they were... workmanlike.
You've got Andy Ritchie and Alan Kernahan on there. Do you know what I mean? They're the lads that you had on there. And you've got Darren Anderton. They've got a setup in the advert where they say, right, lads, let's imagine we're all in the gym. And so they've got John walks on a pec deck. He doesn't even look like he's seen a pec deck in his life. You've got Darren Anderton doing these sit-ups with his hands behind his head. The word crunchy was still 10 years away, I think. It's just like, it's just an absolute shambles in so many ways. But I can't tell you how much that really captured the moment, the glossiness, the shininess. Even at the end, it finishes with what looks like a silhouette of an early Jimmy Bullard must be on a trampoline heading this ball. It was just everything that was about the setting up of the new season, and then jumping into season, the first ever Super Sunday. I think they went on air 2 hours beforehand, and it's like that was unheard of. That was unheard of back then.
Apart from the cup final, that was the only game that would have any build-up on TV. But otherwise, it would be 15 minutes before kickoff.
Yeah, but then there was a reason for it back then, wasn't there, James? Because it's like it was the one live game of the season, and we want to see the teams in the hotel in the morning with Michael Barrymore and Freddie Starr, whoever it was. you had to look back all the way to round one, and there was reasons for that. But the amount of filler they had to do was just unbelievable.
The first Super Sunday was 5 hours long, so that was for Nottingham Forest, a 1-0 win. And Teddy Sheringham scoring a screamer against Liverpool. Going back to that first day, Brian Deane famously got the first ever goal against Manchester United. Reigning champions Leeds get off to a winning start. And then the first Monday night football. And as you've already mentioned, this was like a new thing of Monday night football. The Sky Strikers and the cheerleading squad. Things that would not wash in 2022.
No, they wouldn't.
Sky nicked the idea from the Premier League, from the NFL, which was the biggest money-making sports thing in the world. And they were like, right, we need to do the NFL, but with football. And so that's where the Monday Night Football comes from. That's where the cheerleaders comes from. That's where the loads of build-up and the analysis and all of that is to be like the NFL. It's that thing where you can't have franchise teams because the history is too entrenched in British society for you to just suddenly go, we're going to have franchise teams now. But we can if we try and treat the Premier League teams as if they're franchise teams and make a big deal of that, which, when the teams are Oldham and Sheffield United, it's like you can try and make this glamorous.
There's only one place to start, really, for a Premier League podcast with Brian Deane on it, and that is Saturday, the 15th of August, 1992. Before we relive that famous goal, some context: you'd been at Sheffield United for 4 seasons, you'd fired them from the old 3rd division into the 1st, you'd already got 25 top-flight goals under your belt, and you're an England international at this point. Then comes the start of the Premier League. What can you remember about that transition from kind of old 1st division to Premier League? Was it a big deal as a player on that start of the new season, or was it business as usual?
It's just business as usual, to be honest. Because we sort of like got promotion after promotion, it just seemed like a natural progression for me. I didn't really, I wasn't nervous about playing against anybody anymore. I knew I could score, and so it was more about testing myself against the other top strikers in the division, really.
And that goal you scored was the first of the Premier League era. When did you become aware of that, and what can you remember about the goal itself?
Just the usual, really. I mean, it's funny, I get asked this all the time, and I appreciate it, but it was half time when I come off the pitch. I always scored on the first game of the season, so I had this mindset that we were going in to play Manchester United, probably the best time to play against Manchester United, because the team wouldn't have been sort of like, warm and cooking on gas, and we had a chance. We had a plan. We went into the game. We knew that in terms of possession, they would be better on the ball than us, better players, but we knew that we were quite innovative when it came to set pieces, and a little bit of a leveling of the playing field. We had one plan when we were defending. It was about being responsible for your own player, your individual player. But then it was all about creating space when we were attacking. And when you create space, how you utilize the space that you've created. And that's exactly what we did. And like you say, after, I think it was about 4 minutes, we got a a throw in. Long ball from Carl Bradshaw, headed on, I think, by Clayton Blackmore, and I sneaked between Gary Pallister and Peter Schmeichel. It sounds as simple as that, but honestly, it was. I look back now, and this thing, it worked like a dream. The right managers for me at the right time. Dave Cusack was my manager at Doncaster, and he was the right man at the right time for me. Billy Bremner left and he went to Leeds, and Dave took over as player manager. And immediately he promoted me to the first team training. And after a few sessions, he gave me my debut. Dave was a proper man manager, and things were tough for people then. The players have so much now, and I've been a manager myself, so I know what I'm talking about. We used to come into the changing rooms at full time. I remember Dave would, if we lost, then it was the younger lads who would get it in the neck. Everybody would get it, but then you'd sort of like see his eyes coming round the changing. And I remember we played Mansfield this one day, and we lost 1-0, and he kind of was going around, and I remember when we were coming off the pitch, me and Paul Holmes said, "Right, who do you think's going to get it today?" and we went in, and like Dave looked at me, and he absolutely tore a shred off me, and I felt about that big. And we lost 1-0 to Mansfield, and then the next day I went to see him because I thought, I can't take this no more. I'm a 20-year-old kid who's playing in what is now League One. So I went and I said, "Listen, Gaffer," I said, I don't know if this is for me. I said, I don't know what I'm doing wrong, and maybe I'm not good enough. He said, "Listen," he said, after the game, George Foster comes up to me and he said, "How much do you want for your centre forward?" And Dave said, "You can't have him. He's going to be a top player." And he said, "Listen, Brian," he said, "what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to teach you what you're going to need when you go into other changing rooms. You can't be soft in this game. There's going to be times where, the manager's going to come after you. You've got to be able to cope with that. Forget about the football side of it. You've got to be able to survive. Yeah. And I got it. I absolutely understood exactly what he was talking about after that. And then obviously I went to Sheffield United. He was like a mentor and a guardian angel for me.
So the second match for Deserted Island is a non-Premier League Swansea game. So any Swansea game from outside the top flight, obviously there's a few to choose from. What have you gone for?
I've gone for, it's 1999. We beat Rotherham 2-0 at the Vetchfield. Now, the reason I've gone for this, there was no great significance in that result. But in that game, my favourite Swans player of all time made his debut. We had a Jamaican striker called Walter Boyd, who had absolutely no right to be with a third division side. He was playing in the World Cup the year before for Jamaica in 1998. He was one of the best players they had. Somehow, we'd got him on a free transfer, and I've never seen magic like that. So he started the game, and all of us, you can tell, he's miles above the rest. Like he's playing passes that no one's making the run for. He's so far advanced on that game. At one point, he's kicked the ball into the crowd in frustration because no one's made the run for him. And he scored 2 on that debut. The first was a reaction goal, hit the post. He comes back in a rebound. And the second one was one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen at the Vetchfield. This little ball over the top. He's brought it down on his heel with one touch and just chipped the keeper before even looking. And it was, at that moment, I was like, I've fallen in love. This is my new favourite striker. And he was insane. Like he would, because he's from Jamaica, there were some games he'd refuse to come on because it was too cold. It was absolutely, he was brilliant, but he was a maverick. Like he holds the world record for the fastest ever sending off because he, basically they were telling him to warm up. He didn't want to come on. And they finally coaxed him to go on. And because it's cold and he doesn't want to play, before they restart the game, because there's a free kick going on, he's headbutted the defender and got a straight red. So technically, he was sent off in 0.00 seconds.
I can't imagine he's still doing postman duties between June and August only in the Swansea area these days. Wow, and that's some high praise as well, because obviously as a team that had Lee Trundle, I mean he was known for apart from just being prolific, also some spectacular goals, wasn't there?
Well, Lee Trundle was, for my money, the most entertaining player we had, and then with Walter Boyd, he was just an out-and-out clinical striker. He needed half a chance and he'd score. But what was frustrating about him was, on average, he'd score 2 goals a match. But then also, on average, he'd refuse to play half the season. So it sort of levels out.
Amazing. The Premier League is obviously a huge gear shift for English football, with Sky Sports investing a huge sum to reinvent coverage of football as we knew it. Meanwhile, the England team were toiling under Graham Taylor at the Euros. How do you reflect on that contrast between the domestic game getting a very expensive facelift, just as the national side, fresh off the back of Italia 90, are about to go through one of their bleakest spells?
It's quite interesting, isn't it? Football's a very reactive game. In the game, you can set yourself up a certain way, but you've got to react to how the other team are set up. You react differently to being 1 goal down, to being 3 goals down. It's a very reactive. And I think from a structural point of view, it's also very reactive. So around that time, you've got the European clubs wanted a Super League. Surprise, surprise, just like they do now. The English game was in turmoil financially. We weren't able to compete in Europe because of various reasons. Hooliganism was rife. So the 80s was quite a dark time for football. Coming out of that, Italia 90 basically was a boom in terms of people following England. But really what it actually did was it reignited support in the domestic game more than anything else. The appointment of Graham Taylor then after Bobby Robson was probably not what people thought was going to happen. But it was really predictable because the FA, who had Charles Hughes as like a coaching expert, he'd invented POMO, P-O-M-O, position of maximal opportunity. Hoof it long, chase the ball, and have as many shots on goal as you can. That was kind of his philosophy. And that was flowing through the FA. That was thrown through all their coaching courses. And Graham Taylor was a little bit more of a sophisticated version of that. He'd made some really good young attacking sides at Watford, then Aston Villa, he'd got high up in the table. So he wasn't just a long ball merchant, but he definitely had that reputation. So the FA brought out a blueprint that was supposed to try and change that and bring us more in line with the European game in terms of playing more with more flair, more passing, more technical ability, which again sounds familiar from probably 10 or 15 years ago. So all these sort of reforms are coming into place. And they ended up saying that if we make a better top division, we'll have a better domestic game, which means we'll have a better international game. Foolishly, really, because the best players weren't in England and clubs want short-term success. So if you give the clubs more money, eventually they're going to have to buy better players. They're not going to spend the money on English players just because they're English if they're not good enough, when they can pay the same amount or slightly less to a player from another country. So this is where you get the Premier League coming out with a blueprint. There was a whole host of stories around who wanted what. Some wanted it for greed. Some wanted it because they could make more money from TV, bolster the coffers of their clubs. The FA kind of said, oh, yeah, why don't you just run it yourself, Premier League? That'll be a good idea. And then it sort of disconnects everybody from the football pyramid, which is still very unique in the sense that we've got so many professional clubs. The fact that the Premier League arrives, then eventually, Alan Sugar, I think, said after he basically got the deal done with Sky, he said, what's going to happen is all this extra money, we're just going to funnel it to players in terms of wages and other clubs in terms of transfers, which is basically what happened. And they had to buy more technical players, which were abroad. That made a better product, which meant you could sell it abroad. Then you could be successful when you're back in Europe. And it's that cycle. Then the foreign investment comes in, and it just sort of created that perfect storm, probably, of what we have now, in the sense that there's probably not many English business people who are rich enough to even afford Premier League clubs now. The academy system is the one thing that they sort of missed out in the blueprint. They didn't sort of say you need to have an academy with 20 players from Manchester if you're Man City or Man United or whatever. So all that sort of came about thinking it was going to create this enormous change in the national team. The national team stagnates really under Graham Taylor. Two things with Taylor. He was unlucky with injuries and he made really bad selections. Now, what you couldn't have one without the other. Obviously, he ended up making bad selections because players got injured, but he also ostracised quite a lot of players as well and didn't want to pick flair players. You know, he barely had Gaza coming off Italia 90, and that's tricky. Chris Waddle ends up retiring. John Barnes doesn't get used as much. Peter Beardsley doesn't get used as much. Lineker retires. Euro 92's rubbish from an English point of view, basically. The new Premier League and then the Graham Taylor era kind of don't really sit that well. They're almost like two separate things, but it wasn't supposed to happen like that. It was supposed to be that the domestic game made the international team better.
Interesting what you say about flair players. I mean, of course, one of the players that was absolutely ripping it up in the early years of the Premier League that never got a look in was Matt Letizia. I mean, that's another player that Graham Taylor never fancied, did he?
Alan Ball was the best manager that ever played under, because Alan Ball said to the other 10 Southampton players, get the ball to Matt Letizia and he will do whatever we need him to. Now, I might get this wrong, but I'm sure he scored 25 goals and got 18 assists or 17 assists in the full season. I think he only had a season and a half or 2 seasons with Alan Ball. And his goals and assist ratio, now they'd be like, no, on Twitter when it's like contributions or whatever, Letizia will be the top every time. So Lineker finishes in 92. Alan Smith doesn't really get a look in much after that. But then you go through, you got Shearer and Sheringham. But behind that, you got Fowler and Ferdinand. Then you've got Matt Letizia. Dion Dublin's knocking around at the time. Chris Sutton's around at that time. Ian Wright's around at that time. Andy Cole's, there's 9 forwards alone that you think, if they were playing now, you'd say, actually, they're better than Callum Wilson. They're better than Tammy Abraham. I'd have them in the squad. But back then, almost having that embarrassment of riches really was quite interesting for when Venables arrives in like 94 to take it from there.
Your first real season supporting the Owls was an eventful one, with Danny Wilson joining from Barnsley, guiding you to a comfortable 12th. It's perhaps best remembered, though, for Paulo Di Canio's push on Paul Alcock. Do you remember that match? Were you in the ground that day? What do you remember about that entire incident?
Yeah, I do remember it, and I did go to the game, and Sheffield Wednesday actually won it, which I can't think people don't remember. And that was a great Arsenal team as well under Arsene Wenger. I think most of the side that were part of the Invincibles played on that afternoon. So I can remember it being a good win for Sheffield Wednesday, but obviously the Di Canio push was just shocking. I know it because I've seen replays and numerous TV stuff on it, and I've read Di Canio's input on it. But actually, at the game, I can't really remember looking at the. I just remember the referee falling backwards and then being on the ground, and then Di Canio and Martin Keown were both red carded in sort of a matter of seconds. But it's just astonishing when you look back at it. The referee obviously doesn't help himself because he goes down in slow motion, Paul Alcock. But Di Canio was such a hero of mine at the time. I think it hit me that he wouldn't play for Sheffield Wednesday again after that incident. And him and Carboni were what got us towards the top end of the table in that first season under Danny Wilson. They both wore white boots. That sticks in my mind because I wanted a pair of white boots. And it just an unbelievable incident. It's one that will be talked about forever because it's never happened before, never happened again in the Premier League. And then it sort of transformed Di Canio's career as well, I think, because it was only a couple of years later that he picked up the Fair Play Award from the Premier League when he picked out the ball, caught it, didn't he, while playing for West Ham when a cross was played in when there was a player down. Yeah, a bizarre incident. Again, I think I was only 10, 11, so my understanding of what had happened, probably not all there, but at least I can say I was in there for that iconic moment. And yeah, but it's more about that victory over Arsenal that I tend to remember.
Your cause, of course, isn't helped when you lose Paulo Di Canio, arguably your star player, to an 11-game ban for pushing over Paul Alcock in what turns into his last game for the club as well, before being sold to West Ham. Again, it's another one of those moments where, as a fan, these are iconic moments of the Premier League. You are there, stood right in the middle of it. What goes through your mind on the touchline when you see your player do something like that? Maybe talk us through what happens in the weeks ahead when obviously he has received his ban and eventually does leave the football club.
Well, they're very uncertain times. Like you say, you've got one of your best players and one of the best players in the Premier League who's absent. We couldn't get him back into the country. Paulo himself, he'll say, he had medical certificates to say that he wasn't in the right frame of mind to come back, and depression was setting in, etc. You can't argue with that. You've got to, understand it and get on with it. At that meantime, I was trying to get him back. We had a job of trying to get some results as well, which was never very easy when you're missing, let's say, your star player. So it was very difficult, a very difficult period. And everybody outside of the club itself, I mean, from upstairs and maybe the management, were the ones who knew what was going on. The rest of the fans didn't, and it was very difficult to get it out to them. That we couldn't go out public and say what was going on. The chairman at the time, Dave Richards, said that because he was the chairman of the Premier League, he'd had an agreement with all the chairmen that nobody would touch Paulo, and that we would retain his registration. So if he did go anywhere, go abroad, and they get a fee for him. And then lo and behold, a player that was valued maybe around about anything between £5 and £8 million, he goes for £1 million to West Ham, and that was a big kicking. That in the proverbials really. Because we'd lost a great player for pittance. And again, the words of the chairman, which was allegedly said, had not come to fruition, that somebody had taken a gamble on him. And you can't blame them for that. You can't blame somebody to get a quality player like that at a cheap price. So, but it was a big hit for us. I think from where we were, we had no money as well. We couldn't go out to replace him. Even that money that was given from Paulo was not available to us. So, you not only have you lost somebody, you can't replace them.
Before we let you go, we want to try one brand new game.
Yeah, it's pretty simple. We're going to give you a Premier League player and tell you how many appearances they made in the Premier League era. We'll then give you another player and you will tell us if that player has made more or less appearances in a higher or lower format. Now, the first player is Brian Deane. You'll be playing head-to-head, so we need to decide who's going to go first. Do you want to play by guessing how many games Brian Deane made in the Premier League?
195.
195. James, what's your guess?
I was going to say like 126.
It's 293.
Wow.
So, Marv, would you like to go first or second?
I'll go second.
293.
Okay.
The next player is Dean Saunders. Higher or lower?
Just Premier League?
Yeah.
Lower.
Correct. Dean Saunders is just 196. Very well played. Dean Windass. Higher or lower?
Lower.
Correct. 104 appearances for
But
Dean
that's
Windass.
still loads for Dean Windass, isn't it?
It's about 4 seasons, isn't it? 104.
Which is coincidentally his favourite pizza.
Nigel Winterburn, higher or lower?
Oh, higher.
Correct. 352 appearances for Nigel Winterburn. Is that higher or lower than Lee Dixon?
Ooh, I think Dixon played for longer, so I'm going to say Dixon is higher than Winterburn.
That is incorrect. It is
lower.
You're looking good there, James. So it's over to Marv. Lee Dixon made 305 appearances in the Premier League in total. But is that higher or lower than Lee Carsley?
I think it must be higher.
Midfielder Lee Carsley.
Oh, hang on. He played a long time. He wasn't a player who got injured that often, but I still think higher.
You're going higher.
No, sorry. Carsley's lower. Carsley's lower.
James, just 282 appearances.
That's not fair. He meant lower.
No, I meant lower. I meant Dixon was higher.
You just clarify that before the answer came in there. There was a slight delay, but you were saying that Lee Carsley was lower with 282.
Yeah,
so
I was using the wrong phraseology while I was talking it through in my own head, which is obviously disastrous when you're playing Play Your Apps Right. I'm like the guy who puts his hand up to go to the toilet at an auction. I meant lower than Dixon.
The next player on the board is Thomas Gravison, higher or lower than Lee Carsley?
Lower.
Lower with 149 appearances. The next player is Thomas Sorensen.
Higher.
Higher with 364 appearances.
Oh my God. You think about these names, you think they're so fleeting, but he had 364 Premier League appearances.
He played for Villa for ages.
And what is it, Villa and Sunderland?
How did he get on against his Danish compatriot Peter Schmeichel, higher or lower than Thomas Sorensen's 364 appearances?
So Schmeichel is lower.
You're going to say Schmeichel is lower. He is lower. What happens when we switch to Kasper Schmeichel at the end of the 30th Premier League season? Is Kasper Schmeichel higher or lower than 310 appearances of his dad?
He's higher.
He's just lower, 284 appearances, and we switch back over to James. James,
I would have said that as well.
You start with Kasper Schmeichel with 284 appearances. Next up is Stephen Carr.
Oh, for fuck's sake.
I love how you both came into this so casually, and now the competition is really kicking in.
Because it could be either. What if it's exactly the same? Then what happens?
It's definitely either, James.
All right. Stephen Carr. He did play for a while. He was Spurs, wasn't he? Spurs fullback.
Yeah.
And he sounds like someone making up a name when he's been pulled over. Isn't it? What's your name, sir? Stephen Carr. Oh, really? I'm going to say, fuck it, higher.
It is higher, 377 appearances. So we move on to Jamie Carragher.
You'd think it would be higher.
Is that what you're going with?
I'd say higher.
Yeah, higher, go on.
508 appearances. We are 7 from the end here. Phil Neville. This is a lot. Phil Neville, higher or lower than Jamie Carragher's 508 appearances?
Lower.
It is lower, 505 appearances. But how's Phil getting on against his brother Gary? Is Gary
lower?
Neville? Gary Neville is
no,
lower.
No. Phil is lower. What?
Oh.
What? Oh, that was too confusing. I don't know what happened there.
You went Phil is
I got it right, didn't I? What?
So
you said how is Phil compared to his brother, and I said lower.
Phil is lower.
That's wrong, isn't it?
Gary Neville is lower, which gives Marv control of the board. We've got Gary Neville's 400 appearances. How does that rank against Roy Keane?
Roy Keane is lower.
Roy Keane is lower, 306. How does that rank against Robbie Keane?
Robbie Keane is higher.
Robbie Keane is higher with 349 appearances. How does that rank against Niall Quinn?
Niall Quinn is lower.
Niall Quinn is lower, 250 appearances. But how
One
does
of the few occasions where Niall Quinn is lower than him.
Well, it's funny you should say that, because the next player on the list, 3 from the end, is his strike partner, Kevin Phillips. So is Kevin Phillips higher or lower than Niall Quinn?
What was Niall Quinn again?
Niall Quinn was 250 appearances.
Kevin Phillips is higher than Niall
Kevin Phillips, ironically, is higher than Niall Quinn with 263 appearances. You're 2 from the end. Kevin Phillips versus Ian Wright. Is Ian Wright higher or lower than Kevin Phillips's 263 appearances?
Ian Wright is higher.
Ian Wright is lower.
Oh, right at the end.
With 213 appearances, which means, as the decider, James, if this is right, you win. If you get it wrong, Marv takes the win. Ian Wright, 213 appearances. But how does that rank against Mark Wright?
I would say Mark Wright is lower.
Mark Wright is lower, 137 appearances. James takes the win. Well done, boys. That was surprisingly tense.
Yeah.
I mean, you could just do that for 2.5 hours. People would listen to it.